Brian, and for introducing us to this translation. One of the challenges that the church faces as it moves through history is always adapting to new contexts. And sometimes what we long to do is to hold on to the way things were. For an example, there are some persons who believe that unless it's the King James Version of the Bible, it's not helpful to us as the Word of God. But the Word of God is like water, or like tea, if you like tea, or whatever you like to drink. The Word of God is held by the text. That is to say, the text carries the Word of God, and the Word of God is what refreshes us. It's not the cup. You may have a favorite cup, but it's the thing in the cup that you're drinking that matters to you. Now, I've been thinking a lot about stories this week, and I've had a lot of ideas of how I might begin with you this morning. And I have finally settled on recounting to you a small experience that I had about a conversation among the Cree people in Canada. And the Cree people were having a conversation about what to do with all of the ancient stories, the stories that the ancestors told, the stories by which the values of their communities were transmitted from generation to generation. The Cree people were aware that with the rising of the modern world, these ancient ancestral stories were in danger of disappearing. And their conversation that they had together was about, should we maybe write these things down? Now, I heard this in reference to an opinion by a man whom we know, some of us, Mr. Stanley McKay, who's not so far from us in Manitoba here. And Mr. McKay made the observation that, yes, to take an oral story and to turn it into a written story involves a risk, because the meaning of an oral story may not be found in a written story. But just to keep the stories alive, the Cree people decided that they would write them down. They did not write them down thinking that as written stories they would be better suited to the modern world, but they wrote them down with the idea that someday, somewhere, someone might read the stories and hear the voice of the story. And in that moment, the story would come out of the page or out of the written text and back into the storyteller's heart and become a living word. Now, this is exactly where we stand in our relationship with the Bible. The Bible is about stories that go back down through all of the ages, well before writing was even invented by human beings. That happened maybe about 5,000 years ago in some place called Mesopotamia or such. And I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but gradually writing became a part of human history. And the people of Israel, they also, like the Cree people, wanted to be sure that these stories were not lost as civilization advanced, and so they committed them to writing. But storytelling is best done orally. That is to say, you are better off if you would like to tell a story to your grandchildren, and I'm not saying this as a rule, but as a hint, as a possibility, is to get familiar with the story and then put the book aside and then sit with the child in an intimate way and tell the story from your heart. Now, I've said this before. It's not the details of the story that will touch the child's heart. It's the love of the storyteller. That is what's going to bring the blessing to the child. And once the child begins to grow, as the stories continue to be heard, the child will discover in those stories lessons that are fitting for a good life on our planet together. Now, I have so many stories in my heart that I would love to tell to you. But today I want to more encourage you to be storytellers. And I want to do this just by lifting up the text from Mark. And this text from Mark presents us with imagery that is hard to comprehend. That is to say, 3 persons on the top of a mountain, and all of a sudden reality seems to shift and unusual circumstances take place. Now that's how it is with a story. With a story you can take liberty with the facts, because the story is not about the facts. The story is about the love of God communicated through those stories. And the story about Jesus and Peter and James on that mountaintop is simply told to help the hearers understand something. And what I'd like you to imagine is that Jesus, in those moments, wanted folks to understand that all the stories that they had received from their ancestors through their tradition, the stories about Moses and the stories about Elijah as examples of the law and the prophets, that all of these stories were to bring them blessings. And then Jesus completes what I will call the trinity of storytellers. Now there's Moses, there's Elijah, and there's Jesus. And it turns out that these 3 are one. That is to say, there's one story being told in these 3 different traditions. The tradition of the law, the tradition of the prophets, and with the coming of Jesus, the tradition of wisdom. Jesus represents for us wisdom, the wisdom of God. And wisdom, if you look into your own understanding, is that quality of life which allows us to make decisions that lead to good outcomes. So you are in a life situation and you have to make a choice between this and that. Wisdom allows you to discriminate between what this and that offer you and to choose that option which will bring blessing and not harm, or benefit and not harm. So the stories about Jesus, the stories about Elijah, the stories about Moses, the stories which we have heard growing up and which we have opportunity to tell to our young people, are stories about how it is that God gets involved. And yet God does not get involved by pulling strings like a puppet master. God does not make George go like this and like this. God inspired George. God lets George know that George is loved, in exactly the same way that God lets Phyllis know that she is loved, or Judy, or any one of you. That's why the stories are told. That's why we want to be storytellers, to communicate the love of God. But the Bible does teach us that when we take the stories and carve them into stone and say it has to be this way and it can't be any other way, then those stories are no longer about God's love. They are about something else. They're about, well, you can imagine what they're about because you've been listening to stories all of your life. I am hoping that we will find, as people at this time in the history of the world, within us the desire to learn the story and to tell the story in such a way that it brings blessing to our children, first of all, our grandchildren, but also to our families grown up, also to our neighbors and acquaintances, that we learn to comfortably speak about what it is that matters most to us. One of the great dangers of the modern world is that people spend a lot of time talking about things that really have very little value at all. Things that are simply about how you pass the time on a weekend. But ideally, even those simple stories about your ordinary experience can be used to communicate God's love. Everything depends on what it is in your heart. I said this before as well. It doesn't really matter how smart I am. It doesn't really matter how intelligent I am with the use of language. If I don't care about you, my words are just wind. They're just sounds in the room. And my trust is that God will take my spirit and use it to bless your spirit. And in the same way that we gather here to celebrate the stories of our tradition, we will remember that this is not what the stories are about coming to church. The stories are about what happens in the street, what happens in the workplace, what happens in family social situations, what happens when we're just out there in the world with people that we meet along the way. The disposition of our hearts matters immensely. So all you really have to do to share God's love is when you're going grocery shopping, is just to push your cart, and if you see a child, go wink, 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 smile, 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 get engaged. If you see an elderly gentleman, good day, sir, how are you today? If you see a woman going out the door with a bag heavy, may I help you with that? In this, you are beginning to communicate the story of God's love for this world. So often, if you'll walk into public places, you'll see people walking like this, as if they don't want to see each other. That tells a story. And what's that story about? Nervousness, fear, anxiety, distrust, lack of love? I am hoping we will become people who look one another in the eyes and say, I care about you. I care about you. I like you. Most of the time. Yes. So I am going to close by saying that the stories in the Bible conclose. I just put two words together, close and conclude. You caught that, Mr. Gadsby?
I wasn't going to say anything, but
I could hear you thinking it.
It was with love, George.
Exactly. We sometimes tell stories to help one another learn lessons that are not easy to learn as well. I encourage you to be storytellers and to be good storytellers by letting the love of God that is in you fill those stories and not to be too concerned if you get the story just right. It's the love that matters. So let's sing then. Come, let us sing of a wonderful love. Let's tell stories